The Forbidden City 1435. A young concubine is dragged screaming through torchlit corridors, her silk robes trailing behind her. Like a funeral shroud, the emperor has died, and ancient tradition demands sacrifice. She is one of 16 women selected to accompany him into the afterlife, an honor that means death. In a sealed chamber beneath the palace, eunuchs bind silk cords around her neck. She watches in frozen horror as other concubines are strangled one by one, their bodies carefully arranged around the imperial coffin like ornaments. Some beg for mercy in voices that crack and fade. Some pray silently, tears streaming down porcelain-painted faces. None escape. This is not legend whispered in taverns or folklore embellished over centuries. This is documented history buried in official records and deliberately erased from popular narratives. The practice of human sacrifice, sanctioned by the state, carried out in darkness and hidden behind walls that still stand today. What the emperors did to their concubines went far beyond this ritual death, but burial alive was merciful compared to what awaited those who survived. The imperial harem was not a paradise of silk cushions and romantic devotion. It was a prison wrapped in beauty, a golden cage where thousands of women lived and died within the Forbidden City's blood-red walls. They competed for the fleeting attention of one man who held the power of a god. Girls as young as 13 were selected from across the empire, torn from their families, and presented with a choice that was not a choice: serve the emperor or dishonor your bloodline forever. Once inside those gates, they were ranked in brutal hierarchy, from nameless maids who scrubbed floors to favored consorts who bore sons and tasted fleeting power. The competition was vicious, and unrelenting. Pregnancies meant power elevation, survival, but also danger from rivals who watched with venomous eyes. Women poisoned each other ST with slow-acting toxins that mimicked illness. They bribed eunuchs to spread rumors of infidelity or witchcraft, accusations that could mean torture or execution. Some accused competitors of cursing the emperor's health, knowing the charge alone could condemn them. The emperor held absolute power over their bodies, their futures. Their very breath to be chosen for his bed meant survival for another night. To be forgotten meant slow death in obscurity, aging in silence until you became invisible, a ghost haunting corridors you once walked as royalty. And for those who angered the dragon throne, punishments were designed not just to kill, but to erase them from existence. Concubines accused of infidelity, witchcraft, or political conspiracy faced tortures specifically designed for women, cruelties that male prisoners never endured. The wooden horse, a triangular beam where victims were forced to sit with heavy weights tied to their feet, the pressure slowly tearing them apart from within. The ankle press iron clamps tightened gradually, shattering bones one fragment at a time, while officials asked questions they did not care to hear answered. Some were subjected to waist cutting, sliced in half while still conscious, their upper bodies left to writhe in agony on blood-soaked stone as their executioners watched without expression. Others were thrown into wells of forgotten women, deep pits in remote corners of the palace, where disgraced concubines were left to starve in absolute darkness, their screams unheard beyond the thick walls, their bodies left to rot until even their bones were forgotten. Emperor Yongle, paranoid and obsessed with immortality elixirs, once ordered 16 palace maids strangled after they attempted to assassinate him during a midnight ritual. Their families were hunted down and executed, their names struck from every record. But the cruelest punishment was not physical torture, it was lynching, the death of 1,000 cuts reserved for the highest crimes against the throne. Executioners carved away flesh piece by piece, keeping victims alive for hours, sometimes days, while crowds watched in enforced silence. Even physical. Merciful compared to psychological erasure when a concubine fell from favor, whether through a rival's schemes, a political shift, or simply the emperor's fading interest. The imperial court enacted systematic erasure with bureaucratic precision. Her portraits were burned in courtyard fires, her name removed from genealogies, as if she had never existed. Her children If she had any, were reassigned to rival mothers and forbidden from mentioning her. Eunuchs who had served her were castrated again as punishment or executed to sever all connections to her memory. Some women were exiled to isolated cold palaces, forgotten wings of the forbidden city, where they lived in solitude for decades, forbidden from speaking to anyone, from reading, from even seeing sunlight through shuttered windows. Others were demoted to service roles, forced to scrub the floors they once walked as consorts, wearing servant rags instead of embroidered silk. The psychological torture was calculated and deliberate. They remained alive, but invisible ghosts within their own prison, watching younger women take their place while they faded into nothing. Empress Dowager Cixi herself, who ruled China with an iron fist, ordered concubines thrown down wells when they threatened her power or questioned her decisions. History was rewritten with each erasure, records destroyed, memories forbidden, their suffering vanished as if they never existed. But some stories survived in whispers, in hidden memoirs written by palace eunuchs, in testimony given decades later when the Qing Dynasty had finally fallen, and some witnesses dared to speak. The Boxer Rebellion rages outside Beijing in 1900. Foreign armies march closer each day. Empress Dowager Cixi prepares to flee the capital in disgrace. One concubine, the Pearl Concubine, 24 years old, intelligent, favored by the young emperor, dares to suggest he should stay in Beijing and negotiate peace rather than abandon the city. Cixi's rage is instant and absolute. She orders the young woman dragged to a palace well in the courtyard. The Pearl Concubine begs for her life, her voice echoing of ancient stones. She clings desperately to the well's edges as eunuchs pry her fingers loose one by one. Then she is pushed. The splash echoes through the courtyard, followed by screams that, according to Cixi's chief eunuch, who later testified, lasted several minutes before silence finally fell. Her body was not retrieved for months, left to decompose in stagnant water. When it was finally pulled up, her skull was shattered from impact, her fingernails broken and blooded from clawing at the stone walls in darkness. The official record died of illness during the evacuation. The truth was buried with her bones hidden for decades, and she was far from the last victim of imperial cruelty. Even in the 20th century, as the Qing Dynasty crumbled, and the modern world pressed in, the abuse continued behind closed doors. Pui, the last emperor, though stripped of real power and reduced to a puppet, maintained sadistic control over his household. His concubines later reported beatings, psychological torment, and forced opium addiction to keep them compliant and docile. Wonrong, his primary consort, gave birth to a daughter in 1935. Rumored to be fathered by another man during her captivity under Japanese control. The infant was taken from her arms and killed, likely by Japanese handlers or palace officials who saw the child as a liability. Wonrong descended into madness, addicted to opium, imprisoned as political tides shifted, and eventually left to die in a communist prison camp in 1946. Her body was tossed into an unmarked grave. Photographs from her final years show a skeletal frame, eyes hollow and empty, a woman destroyed by forces far beyond her control. The dynasty had ended, but its cruelty lingered like a curse that would not break. The systems that enabled such horrors were dismantled, but the scars remained invisible and unacknowledged. The Forbidden City still stands today, its golden roofs gleaming under Beijing's polluted sky. Modern China has sanitized the imperial past for tourists, and national pride brochures show architectural splendor and romantic legends of devoted concubines who chose death over dishonor. But beneath the palace, archaeological teams have discovered mass graves, hundreds of unidentified female remains, some showing signs of strangulation, blunt force trauma, and the distinctive marks of waist cutting. Official histories remain deliberately vague, attributing deaths to illness or unfortunate accidents. Why the silence? Because acknowledging systemic brutality against women complicates nationalist narratives of ancient glory and celestial harmony. The concubines who suffered, whose names were erased, whose bodies were discarded like broken pottery, whose screams echoed through palace Halls for centuries deserve to be remembered not as romantic footnotes, but as human beings who endured unimaginable cruelty. Their agony was not tragic romance or noble sacrifice. It was state-sanctioned violence enabled by absolute power and cultural structures that treated women as expendable possessions, objects to be used and discarded at will. What Chinese emperors did to their concubines was not just erased from history, it was deliberately hidden, buried beneath layers of propaganda and nationalist myth-making. And perhaps the most unforgivable act is not the crime itself, but the centuries of silence that followed, the deliberate choice to forget, to sanitize, to pretend it never happened. The Forbidden City at dusk, vast, beautiful, silent, built on bones no one speaks of.